European democracy is in peril, not because of populists or right-wingers, as is so often claimed, but because of the elites. Back in December, a European Union nation had its presidential election abruptly cancelled. When the first round of voting gave a clear lead to an anti-establishment candidate, the establishment moved swiftly to have the election annulled. This brazenly anti-democratic power grab took place in Romania. Its Supreme Court overturned the presidential elections in order to block the rise of Călin Georgescu, an admittedly oddball, ultra-nationalist candidate who's built a big following on TikTok. An appeal against the decision was rejected by the Romanian courts. An attempt to petition the European Court of Human Rights has been dismissed. The Romanian state accuses Georgescu of benefiting from both Russian interference on social media and favourable treatment by TikTok's algorithms. But whatever attempts foreign actors might have made to influence the election, the suggestion that hundreds of thousands of Romanian citizens voted for a candidate purely on the basis of foreign social media postings is absurd on the face of it. The unsettling truth is that the results of this election were discarded because the powerful didn't like the outcome. You may be wondering where all the outcry has been. The European Union and its backers across the continent love to pose as defenders of democracy, but they've mostly responded to this scandal with silence. Worse still, I dare say that the Euro elites looked on at Romania's outrageous turn against democracy, not so much with horror, but with nodding approval. While no other EU country has quite gone as far as Romania, by cancelling an election to keep the wrong people out of power, establishment parties across Europe have found plenty of other ways to undermine democracy over the past year or so. Rattled by the rise of populism and with their authority wasting away, Europe's leaders have resorted to ever more authoritarian ways to maintain their grip on power. In Germany, senior members of Olaf Scholz's flailing government have floated the idea of banning the right-wing AfD party outright. The AfD is already subjected to surveillance by the German Secret Service on the grounds that it's a suspected threat to democracy. Whatever else one might think of the AfD, this top-down demonisation campaign clearly isn't working. It's currently second in the national polls and is beating all three of the parties in the government coalition ahead of the elections next month. Even when the AfD wins elections, as it did last year in the eastern state of Thuringia, the mainstream parties can still keep it out of government by refusing to let it into any coalition. This cordon sanitaire strategy ensures that AfD voters' wishes will effectively be voided, regardless of how well their party performs. All across Europe, it seems that whoever wins elections, establishment technocrats always end up in power. In France, last year's snap legislative elections delivered huge gains for the hard-left New Popular Front and Marine Le Pen's hard-right National Rally. Together, the left and right deprived President Macron's centrists of a parliamentary majority. Yet Macron responded to the mass public rejection of his government by appointing two successive prime ministers in his own technocratic centrist mould. Over in the Netherlands, despite the victory of hard-right firebrand Geert Wilders in 2023, the government that came to power 6 months later was led by Dick Schoof, a former civil servant and head of the Secret Service. This shift from democracy to technocracy has been going on for a long time. A study published in 2023 found that the proportion of technocratic or apolitical government ministers in Europe surged by 50% between 2000 and 2020. Worse still, these technocrats tend to occupy the most important offices, like Prime Minister or Finance Minister. Of course, the EU apparatus has also played a leading role in this degradation of democracy. Not only is the EU a thoroughly anti-democratic institution, in which European-wide laws are made not by the people or their representatives, but by unelected commissioners, it also interferes in national democratic politics. One former EU bigwig went as far as to praise Romania's cancellation of its presidential election.
The Élysée Palace calls him a man of action.
Thierry Breton, a former EU commissioner, made this startling intervention during a discussion on French TV about how Europe should respond to Elon Musk. The tech baron has personally endorsed the AfD ahead of Germany's federal elections in February and has allowed populists across Europe to spread their message on his platform, X. Breton's solution to Musk's meddling? We did it in Romania, and we will obviously do it in Germany if necessary, he said. In other words, if the German election doesn't go the right way, then it should be cancelled by those who know better. Breton has since claimed that his words were misinterpreted, saying the EU has neither the power nor the inclination to overturn the German elections. He says he merely meant that the law should be enforced fully, and that Musk's X should comply with the EU's content moderation rules. But perhaps Breton doth protest too much. After all, it'd hardly be out of character for the Brussels set to try to eject political leaders it dislikes. Breton is right that Brussels doesn't technically have the power to cast election results aside, but it has used covert means to overthrow elected governments in the past, and it has continually worked to overturn referendum results that challenge EU rule. The EU develops a serious taste for ousting uncooperative governments during the Euro crisis. In 2011, the then Greek Prime Minister George Papandreou briefly flirted with opposing EU-mandated austerity measures. Soon enough, a coalition of Germany, France, the International Monetary Fund, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank applied a mixture of behind-the-scenes pressure, financial blackmail, and very public threats to force him to resign. His government was then replaced with an unelected Government of National Unity, led by an EU-approved technocrat who was willing to accede to Brussels' economic diktats. Later that same year, Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi was thrown out of office and replaced with Mario Monti, an unelected EU apparatchik. Timothy Geithner, who was the US Treasury Secretary at the time, has since revealed he was approached by EU officials asking for help with a scheme to try to force Berlusconi out of power. Brexit represented the first time in the EU's history that a referendum that went against Brussels wasn't either ignored or rerun. Although that wasn't for want of trying on the part of Britain's elite Remainers.
Must be put to a referendum with Remain as an option, and Labour will be campaigning for Remain.
Ireland was twice forced to hold second do-over referendums when voters defied the commissioners. The first followed the Irish people's rejection of the Nice Treaty in 2001. There was also a rerun of the referendum that rejected the Lisbon Treaty in 2008. The Lisbon Treaty was itself a repackaged version of the European Constitution, which had been rejected by the French and the Dutch in separate national referendums back in 2005. Before those votes were even held, Jean-Claude Juncker, the then head of the European Council, made it abundantly clear to European citizens that their votes would count for nothing. If it's a yes, we will say, on we go, he said. And if it's a no, we will say, we continue. Even after 55% of French voters backed no, Juncker pretended that the results were somehow unclear. I am still very much in doubt when I look at this very mixed response in France, he said. Nowadays, the EU concentrates most of its meddling on Central and Eastern Europe. From 2017 onwards, Brussels began imposing various sanctions on Poland, 2 years after the right-wing Law and Justice Party came to power. According to the EU, the sanctions were in response to the Polish government's reforms to the judiciary, which Brussels claimed were an affront to the rule of law. In 2022, the EU withheld over €100 billion in funding that was earmarked for Poland's post-lockdown economic recovery. It said these funds would only be restored if the judicial reforms were reversed. Yet in December 2023, when Donald Tusk, former head of the European Council, became Polish Prime Minister, the funds were released, even though the judicial reforms that the EU said it was so concerned about remained intact. Viktor Orban's right-wing government in Hungary has also become a whipping boy of the EU. It's targeted by countless financial sanctions and endless resolutions in the European Parliament, sometimes over social and cultural issues. And it's not just countries that fall into financial difficulties or rulers who take the wrong side in the culture war that the EU has in its crosshairs. Ahead of last year's European Parliament elections, a raft of new EU laws came into force, including the Digital Services Act, the Media Freedom Act, and the Artificial Intelligence Act. These handed vast new powers to Brussels to regulate online speech. Elon Musk, owner of X, alleges that the EU offered him a secret deal. Apparently, if he agreed to censor content as Brussels decreed, and kept quiet about it, officials would waive potentially millions of euros in fines. Musk claims that other major platforms agreed to this quid pro quo. Now, the EU denies that there have ever been any such deals, but social media firms working secretly with governments to censor content is a well-documented phenomenon. Mark Zuckerberg recently told Joe Rogan that his firm Meta censored vast numbers of Facebook posts at the insistence of the Biden administration.
They pushed us super hard to take down things that were honestly were true.
The clear aim of the EU's new empire of censorship is to limit the reach of Europe's insurgent populists. Brussels accuses these parties of spreading disinformation and hate and insists their speech must be restricted. They see the populists as a threat to freedom and democracy that must be resisted by any means necessary. But if you're censoring in the name of freedom, or calling for elections to be cancelled in the name of democracy, then you are clearly in the realm of doublespeak. No doubt there are some deeply questionable and some genuinely reactionary parties that have cropped up in Europe in recent years. Given that the left has thrown its lot in with the establishment on so many key issues, and so few politicians of any stripe are willing to listen to ordinary people's concerns, the hard right has regrettably been allowed to dominate the anti-establishment populist field in many countries. Even so, you won't find a single populist leader in Europe who is agitating for the suspension of democracy or the banning of political parties, whereas the EU elites have done little else in recent years. The establishment knows that its power is waning, and so, like a wounded animal, it is gnashing its teeth and thrashing around more violently than ever. The threat to democracy comes not from the populists, but from a European elite that is desperate to bring the populists down and put voters back in their box.